So thank you very much. Thanks to Anne, Rob, the DATAMIND team, and particularly to MQ for supporting this event and supporting me as well. I think it's great to be a part of what is happening in mental health data science, and I think it's been really transformative from the genomics point of view, which I'm going to speak about today to an extent. It's changing the way that we do things. What Anne asked me to talk about today was a new study, so new funding that we've had. And so this is something called the MRC Mental Health Platform Hubs. And so I'll come on to talk about that. But before that, I'm going to give you some further background. So this is particularly about diagnosis, and this is very different from what Andy was talking about. So longitudinal cohorts are of incredible value and will always be for common mental disorders. For severe mental illness, such is the impact of those diagnoses that people with moderate to severe forms of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, don't take part in longitudinal cohorts. And those that are in there are very useful because they tend to be from the milder end of the severity spectrum of those conditions. But our research relies upon, as Andy touched on in the answer to the last question, really approaching people through clinical services in the NHS. And I think that's going to continue to be a really key element. But actually what we need to do is learn from how rich the longitudinal data sets are and develop similar resources, I think. So I'll speak about what some of the limitations are of the categorical approach to diagnoses as they are at the moment, why I think it's important that we question that and challenge it, and talk about how genetics may help that, and then talk about the hub and some related projects. So this is a guy who over a century ago, Emil Kraepelin, made a division between severe mental illnesses, particularly schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, that stays with us to this day. So this was essentially what he and his team did, was went out to long-stay psychiatric inpatient units and wrote down people's symptoms. And so this was the data science of the day. And then essentially did a rudimentary form of cluster analysis whereby they looked at conditions or people in whom those symptoms co-occurred more often than they didn't. And from that, he derived the idea of these two diagnoses, dementia praecox, so precocious dementia, what came to be known as schizophrenia, and manic depressive insanity, what we now conceive of as bipolar disorder. And they sit apart. So, in the diagnostic systems that there are, then classically bipolar disorder is characterized by mania, depression. Cognition wasn't thought to be affected, and there was typically thought to be complete recovery between episodes. Schizophrenia, the cardinal symptoms originally were cognition, but actually positive symptoms of psychosis, so delusions, hallucinations, and other symptoms, and a fairly negative picture about what the longitudinal course of that was. The problem is it gets messy, and Kraepelin himself recognized this. So there are people with features of both these disorders, and so then was conceived of this intermediate diagnosis called schizoaffective disorder, whereby people experienced symptoms from both disorders. But actually, this speaks to an underlying truth, and that is that people in each of these diagnostic groups actually have varying degrees of positive psychotic symptoms, of mood symptoms as well, and indeed of cognitive impairment. And this is has emerged from research across these disorders in transdiagnostic research in the last decade or so. And there's also a range of functional outcomes, both within the disorders themselves and across disorders. So this begs the question, are we better conceiving of these things in a dimensional rather than a categorical sense? The other thing that overlaps between the groups is the etiology, so what is causing these conditions. And there are overlaps in the social, the biological, and as represented by the biological, genetic risk factors as well. Is this important? Well, I'd argue it's crucially important because actually these categorical diagnoses inform something as simple as research funding calls, but also the design of services. So there's been a real advance and commitment to funding specialist psychosis services. There hasn't been the same investment in bipolar disorder or mood disorder services to date. So I think the way we conceive of these problems is really important. And it also speaks to the industry that there is behind diagnoses. They undoubtedly have benefits, and a lot of people find, both patients and clinicians find diagnoses very helpful. I think we've got to recognise that, but we've also got to recognise the limitations that they impart. Okay, so why genetics in this picture? Well, we use genetics, and I'm conscious that I'm in an audience where genetics might be something that isn't part of your day-to-day work. Ooh. Sabotaged because I'm speaking about genetics. Whilst we're waiting, I'll tell you a brilliant story. So I bumped into somebody from school last weekend who's an academic in Swansea and came up to me and said, "I've seen your poster in Greg's." And I was like, brilliant, my devotion to the steak slice has finally been recognised. But no, it was a poster for today's session in the Swansea University Greg's, unfortunately. Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so why do we perform genetics? Well, if we look at advances as far as developments of new medication treatments in other fields, a lot of them have derived from being able to access the tissue in question, be that cardiovascular disease, cancer, liver, hepatic disease, or whatever. It's very difficult for us to do that. So principally, genetics gives us a window into the underlying biology and tissue involvement that there can be. And I think that's a really important. We need new molecular targets to develop new treatments. And those actually encouragingly are emerging of late, both supported by genetics, but also independent of genetics. But the other thing, and particularly pertinent for today's discussion, is that genetics can give us a means of validating stratification. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that, but also can be part of, and I think it will always only be part of, prediction algorithms that may help us decide where resources go as far as people's longer term outcomes and their chances of benefiting from more intensive treatments. There's also clinical genomics, and I'll come on to talk about that new service that Louise spoke about very briefly. Pharmacogenomics is making real strides, both in England and in Wales, and in mental health pharmacogenomics. There's going to be a lot of news coming out in the next few years about how genomics might inform prescribing and hopefully limiting adverse effects and exposure to otherwise toxic agents that people wouldn't benefit from. And then finally, and maybe particularly for this audience and with the longitudinal cohorts in mind, one of the important things about linking genomics data is that it can help us with causal analyses, particularly with longitudinal data sets, but also other methodological approaches like neuroimaging. This was what was predicted psychiatric genetics would look like. It was actually over 20 years ago. And this is essentially about negative selection. So this is a Darwinian process whereby along the x-axis here is the frequency of a genomic variant, and then on the y-axis is effect size. And the more common something is, the smaller its effect size. The more rare it is, the higher its effect size. And that's because if something's got a large effect, in disorders like we're talking about, whereby they have an effect on people's fecundity, their likelihood of having children, those variants get selected out of the population very quickly. So the ones that persist as common variants in the population are only those with small effects on risk. So that's what was predicted, and this is the state of the art as far as schizophrenia genomics goes. So 15 years ago, this page would have been completely blank. Okay, and now there are over 100 genes that have been identified from common genetic variation. That's largely through the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium group that I co-lead, but is actually, like Andy said, is the result of hundreds of researchers researchers' resource over a number of years and bringing together that data. So over 90,000 cases of schizophrenia, over 500,000 population controls. It's easy to do that with genetic data because it's all binary, essentially. It's 0, 1s or 2s across the genome. So I think geneticists realized over a decade ago that we needed to do this and bring it together. So this is people across 50 countries, 400 researchers who've developed this data. And so that's the common variant side. And then there is these rare genetic variants, both point mutations, so variants at individual base pairs, the letters change in, individual letters. And then in green, these things called copy number variants, which are big bits of duplicated or deleted DNA. So millions of variants. So just to talk about CNVs, because this is important for the rest of the talk. So these are segments of DNA on a chromosome that you can see here are either deleted, so the C segment is missing from this chromosome on the left, or duplicated, so you've got a double copy. And all the genetic material is either deleted, and so the expression of that genetic data is implicated, is decreased, or it's increased in a duplication. And the relevance of this to our discussion this morning is that the poster child really of copy number variants was a variant called 22q11 deletion, and some 30 years ago now, this was recognized as really increasing risk of schizophrenia. So a quarter to a third of people with this genetic change will develop psychosis and schizophrenia. By far the biggest risk factor that has ever been identified for schizophrenia, short of having two parents with schizophrenia. And we've recently, or more recently, shown that actually the opposite genetic change, a duplication in the same region, is protective against schizophrenia. So this suggests that there's important biology at that locus. And colleagues in Cardiff have gone on to show that actually this isn't just this one copy number variant. There are a whole host of copy number variants that increase risk. These are very rare individually, so typically 0.1 to 0.5%, and collectively affect around 3.5 to 4% now of people with schizophrenia. So they're rare conditions, but they're important. And this is work particularly led by Professor George Kiroff and Elliot Rees in Cardiff. The other thing about these things is that they don't just increase risk of schizophrenia, they operate transdiagnostically. And so they increase risk of bipolar disorder and depression to a limited extent, but much more so to other neurodevelopmental disorders, to epilepsy, to autism, to intellectual disability. And as well as that, they increase risk of physical health conditions. And so this got us thinking, is this of clinical utility? So we know that people with severe mental illnesses die 20 years younger than their population compatriots. Why is that? It's largely due to physical illness, and it's because people aren't investigated, things aren't picked up or aggressively managed the same as those in severe mental illness as everyone else. And so could this help us do this? And so we set this thing up called the All Wales Psychiatric Genomics Service. So this takes referrals from genetics, but also from psychiatric services. And really we were able to form it because it's an all Wales service that sits in Cardiff in the health board that I work in, but it also brings together mental health and the psychiatric genomics expertise in Cardiff. And it's been a real boon. It's described in this paper. And just to recognise Donna Duffin, who's the genetic counsellor in the service, and Kim Kendall, a senior academic trainee. The other thing that we're looking at in that is something called polygenic risk scores, and these are important biomarkers. So this is the first genetics that has been recognised by the Federal Drug Agency to inform treatment, and this is a cumulative genetic score of your risk for a condition or a trait. And the way we've looked at this, and this is Sophie Legg, who's a brilliant postdoc who's led this work, is to see where the polygenic scores can actually help us look at dimensions of diagnosis. And this is in schizophrenia. And just to cut a long story short, the schizophrenia polygenic risk score is more associated with disorganized symptoms, whereas the other symptoms are more associated with bipolar and depression polygenic scores. And so this provides us with some validity of the stratification based on genomics of these dimensions across the symptom groups. So that was the backstory behind this. And so this is this mental health hub, the South Wales and South West Mental Health Hub that we put in a proposal a year ago now. It's in Cardiff, in Swansea, and then across the southwest of England, so Bristol, Bath and Exeter. But crucially, it's also been informed from its outset by lived experience. So Tanya Gergel is a co-investigator from Bipolar UK, and Adferiad, which is a Welsh organisation that provides care, but also representation of those with mental illness and more widely with underrepresented groups. And so they've been part of the research from its outset, and we're really excited about their continued involvement. What are we going to do in it? Well, there's two main purposes. The first is, and this is going to be challenging, but we're excited to begin it, is to recruit a really diverse a cohort of those with schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder and bipolar disorder. Those people will undergo a very in-depth phenotyping, including biological measures, but also developmental and cognitive measures. And then working for the Bays for Health Network, we'll look to see if we can derive dimensions or clusters within that data that would suggest that we can move beyond the current diagnostic categories. We're doing really in-depth genomics, so something called long-read genomics on these people, and methylomics, and John Mill in Exeter is leading on that. But crucially, we're also working with DATAMIND, and the data infrastructure for this is going to be crucial. So this is one of 5 hubs nationally that will form the mental health platform. Anne and DATAMIND will be providing the data infrastructure and making this data really available to the community very early on as it's being generated, as much as we can do. And the other key element is sales involvement in this. And Anne is working with Anita Thapper and others in Cardiff, Joanna Martin, on Workstream 2, which is looking at the developmental and clinical pathways of those who end up having diagnosis of bipolar disorder and schizophrenia in Wales. So Anne and I've worked together over a decade forming e-cohorts of those with psychosis in Wales. And now we're going to look retrospectively and see what the pathways were to try and give us clues as to how we can address delayed diagnosis in bipolar disorder, but also some of the social and developmental determinants that are important in these groups. And as well as that, I suppose the other aspect of the hub and platform is the early career and mid-career researcher developmental element of this. So we're going to have a launch probably at the beginning of next year, but actually we're hoping to develop a local network of people that will access this data and for whom it will be available. So I'd really encourage people to keep an eye out for that. And I want to finish off with this guy. So you can't come to this part of South Wales without thinking about this person, who was an epidemiologist who worked in Cardiff and then gave it up because he saw research as being a fool's errand because he didn't have the longitudinal cohorts. And he went to work as a GP in Glencorrwg, which is just, you'll have come past it on the train or driving, just by Port Talbot. And his most important insight was something called the inverse care law, which we might touch on this afternoon. But this was the idea that those in greatest need of care are the least likely to get it. And I think that applies to research as well. The most difficult people that we need to involve in research are actually the most difficult to involve in research, and it needs strategy and effort to make sure that they're involved. And the other thing he said was that as doctors, our job is really, not to treat an illness, but is to develop an understanding of somebody's story with them. When we set up the genetic service, we were really bothered about, are we going to find as many genetic variants as we think we can? Does that mean that? And there are people going for cardiac scans. We picked up through the service our first kidney abnormality, and somebody's having an operation on the basis of that. So that has been proven to be the case. But the most powerful thing is just providing an element of explanation for people that they didn't previously have, and I think that's been a really powerful element. Thank you.
Wonderful talk. Thank you so much, James. And what a beautiful way to end your presentation as well. While you're thinking about your questions, we have 10 minutes for questions before coffee break. I will start with asking you about your experience working with groups of people with lived experience on your project. Can you tell us a little bit more about how it went, and maybe that would be related to, the point that you finished with about...
Yeah, sure. So I think, and we've had a relationship with Adferiad through the National Centre for Mental Health, which is the Welsh BRC that Swansea and Cardiff are part of. So that's been an ongoing relationship, and it was a really easy conversation to get them on board because they're really interested in this stuff themselves. With Bipolar UK, certainly from a personal point of view, it's the first time that we've had this interaction. And Tanya Gergel, who's their research lead, has been absolutely brilliant. So she's worked with McPinn and MQ and others in the past, but is really interested in the methodologies of how the involvement of those lived experience can inform us as researchers, but also the opposite, how people with lived experience can learn about research. So I think in that respect, we really will be genuine co-production. And so one thing we're going to do is to try and, Tanya calls it, and we'll speak about it much more eloquently than me, but about democratising involvement. So we're going to have a traditional lived experience advisory panel to inform the development of the protocol, but actually then everyone coming into the study or even approached about the study is going to be offered involvement in the study on their terms. So that might be, taking part in a telephone conversation, completing a survey. But the idea is that we just broaden that involvement to hundreds of people, hopefully. And so, yeah, that's a really exciting element of it. The other good thing is being to see Bipolar UK and Adferiad, who haven't worked together before, but have just already spoken and are doing projects independent of it. So I think that's a really key element.
I hope that you're going to publish about the experience.
Yeah, indeed.
That would be really interesting.
That is a key outcome, I think.
Yes, Tom.
James,
Hiya.
fantastic talk. I've been using this all through the Global Mind stuff. Going right back to the beginning about symptoms and breaking down those diagnostic categories, to what extent do you think there's an issue that these categories have existed for so long and they are so embedded in the care system that the recording of transdiagnostic features is being biased because clinicians they know that these are the symptoms that lead to this diagnosis, so if they think the patient has that diagnosis, they can go looking for those symptoms, and there's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy element of the kind of diagnostic orthodoxy.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I think, so most mental health professionals will be trained, definitely psychiatrists, to do a mental state examination. That's the really core skill. That's the equivalent of your physical health system review in general medicine. And that relies upon you asking questions about all those symptoms, actually, from mood to thoughts of self-harm, to psychosis, to cognition. So you would hope that is done. I mean, Ben, you know better than anyone working with electronic health, secondary care, electronic health care records, that isn't the case. And I'm sure what you say is right to a degree. What we were able to do, so we developed our schizophrenia data set in Cardiff on the back of what Nick Craddock and Ian Jones had done before in bipolar disorders. We asked exactly the same questions. And even then, there's definitely a diagnostic bias, to be honest, in the way that questions are framed. But I think if you can do that, then you can minimize that effect. And, it's about accommodating biases that exist in all this data. I should say, what we really yearn in genomics is that clinical level of data. So bringing together all those samples from across the world has been brilliant and not easy, I hesitate to say easy, but doable for the genomics because it's simple data in many respects. There's a lot of it, but it's simple. What we haven't got in those data sets is the clinical features, and we really need that. And I think that's why, so we're working together on something called UK and Global Minds, which will bring genomic data, detailed genomic data, together with clinical data that Acrivia hold on the electronic health record. And I think we do really need that if we're going to, if we're going to follow this path that I've outlined.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I forgot to ask people who ask questions introduce themselves. And it is Tom.
Sorry.
Your name is Tom.
My name is Ben.
Ben.
Close enough.
Oh,
So I'm from Acrivia.
perfect. Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi. So,
Hi.
excuse me, I'm Sarah. I work with John's team. That's a senior
Excellent.
officer. Oh gosh, okay. So, slightly different question. You mentioned earlier the difficulty with recruiting people with severe and medium sort of mental health illness. How do you propose to go about this? Particularly given that there may not be the level of engagement that you would expect for someone maybe with like less severe mental illness. Would you potentially consider lived experience from, say, family members or people who maybe are associated with people suffering from schizophrenia and bipolar who may not be able to approach you directly?
Do you mean recruiting them or using them as a means to recruit their relatives?
A bit of both. So I was thinking, obviously, you might struggle to get someone with severe schizophrenia or bipolar disorder on board because they may not access the service.
Yeah.
But often you get family members who may try and access healthcare or refer a family member that they have concerns about. So could you potentially engage the family members and get their opinions of living alongside?
Oh, right, as informants.
Living alongside maybe a relative with a disorder.
Yeah, that's a
Obviously
really good
wording it badly.
point. Yeah. So we do that already for people at that very severe end of the spectrum, but those people are still very underrepresented, even within clinical cohorts that are recruited from secondary care. And I think we need to do it. We've learned a lot about improving representation. Andy talked about some of the cohorts that have really been groundbreaking in that sense. Born in Bradford, Genes and Health have led the way in that respect. And the way that they've been successful, as I understand it, is working with the communities that represent those people. And so we've got to think of developing equivalent strategies to recruit those with severe mental illness, I think. And it's not simple, it's really hard work. As part of this UK Minds project, we've been doing this, and we will do it as part of the mental health mission. And it's really hard work. You need people that are devoted and really skilled doing it. And I think it's an under-recognised skill, but one that we crave, really.
Wait, okay. Quick question?
A sort of question and comment. I guess one of the things that we're hearing coming through the system now is that post-COVID, recruitment across the board, particularly in these groups, is harder. So there are certain cohorts and surveys that have had funding to do enhanced sampling in ethnic minority groups, and they're absolutely not meeting those targets. So it's something I think we all, after the lessons of COVID, I think it's going to need a lot of resources.
Yeah. The other thing is not just the conditions themselves. So in ALSPAC, for instance, so Joanna Martin in Cardiff has shown that genomic risk of schizophrenia is associated with attrition in ALSPAC. So you're less likely to stay in a cohort if you've even got a genomic predisposition to a condition. So I think we do need to be aware of it, but it's really important to solve it. The other thing I'd just suggest, sorry Louise, CLOS UK, which is the sample that Louise started at the outset, got samples from people without their consent. Now, this was under the Human Tissue Act, provision to do that for the greater good, in the same way that a lot of the data resources come with that in mind. And I think we shouldn't ignore the possibility of that, because what that has allowed us to do is access a really representative cohort of those with schizophrenia. Sorry.
That's the worst part of the job of a chair, I think, kind of having to stop really interesting kind of discussion. But I know that MQ people at the back are staring at me now, so we need to stick to the schedule.
They like this.
Yeah, I know. I invite you to keep on asking questions to both Andy and James during coffee. We have a 20-minute break.